Welcome to the Anglican Papalist. That title is not a gimmick. It's a confession. It names a road, a conviction, and a home. For some people, Anglican and Papalist sound like words that should cancel each other out. England and Rome, Canterbury and the Pope, tradition and submission. But for me and for many others who have found our way into the personal ordinariate, those things were never finally opposed. They were held in tension until the Church herself made a place where they could be held together. This series is about that story. It's about a movement that began long before me, but which I came to recognize as my own. It's about the people who believed that the English liturgical and spiritual tradition did not have to be destroyed in order to come home to Rome. It's about the way God brought that conviction to fulfillment in the ordinariate. And it is, in part, about my own journey into the Catholic Church. I did not always know how to name that journey. But when I looked at the old Anglican Papalists, I recognized something in them that I already believed with all my heart. First, that the Bishop of Rome is not just one bishop among many, but the necessary center of unity for the universal church. Second, that the teaching of the First Vatican Council, including papal infallibility, are not corruptions, but clarifications of that office. Third, that the church must resist modern cultural pressure when the pressure conflicts with historic Christian teaching. And fourth, that separation from Rome is not something to celebrate or normalize, but something that must be healed. I also knew something else. I loved the English spiritual identity that I had discovered on my road to Rome, having grown up not quite religious and then finding God, finding Anglicanism, and then ultimately landing in Catholicism. I did not want what I had learned, what I had discovered, to be erased. I wanted it brought home. That is why the Anglican Papalists matter to me, and that is why I joined the Ordinariate as a Catholic. Before we go any further, we need to define a word that I've already used a couple times: the Ordinariate. The personal Ordinariate is a structure within the Catholic Church created by Pope Benedict XVI, so that groups of former Anglicans and others formed in that heritage could enter into full communion with Rome while retaining elements of the liturgical and spiritual patrimony that has enriched us. It's not a denomination outside of the church. It is fully Catholic. It is a home inside the church where Anglican patrimony is not discarded, but purified, received, and preserved. That matters because the Ordinariate is not merely a historical curiosity. It's the concrete answer to a question that had haunted Anglican Papalists for generations. Can the English tradition come home without ceasing to be itself? The answer, in the life of the church, is yes. Not by compromise, but by fulfillment. For someone like me, that is not an abstract theological claim. It is personal. I came to see that the Ordinariate was not simply a place where Anglican things are allowed to survive. It is a place where those treasures can finally be placed in the fullness of Catholic faith and Catholic obedience, without the old fractures that separated them from Rome. It's a profound gift. To understand why that matters, we need to understand the tradition behind the name. Anglican Papalist is not just an Anglo-Catholic with fancy tastes. It is a specific historical position within Anglicanism, the conviction that the Church of England was not meant to remain permanently separate from Rome, and that true Catholicity required communion with the See of Peter. That position was not the majority view. It was often isolated, suspect, and misunderstood, but it persisted. It persisted in clergy who loved the English liturgical inheritance, but refused to treat separation from Rome as normal. It persisted in the theologians and the priests who believed that Catholic order, Catholic sacrament, and Catholic authority belonged together. And it persisted in people who understood that the visible unity of the church is not optional. One of the clearest voices in that tradition was Father Henry Joy Fines Clinton, who founded the Catholic League in 1913. He was not merely interested in ceremony, style, or nostalgia. He believed that the Catholic identity meant real communion with Rome. He remained within the Church of England, but he did so with the conviction that the separation itself was a wound. That kind of witness is powerful precisely because it's costly. He lived inside a tension that he never pretended was easy. And that is part of why he matters. He represented a kind of fidelity that does not settle for appearances. He saw the problem clearly and refused to call the wound healthy. When I first looked at the old Anglican Papalists, I did not just see a historical movement. I saw beliefs that I came to hold by the time I was in the Anglican spirituality. I saw a conviction that the Pope is the center of unity for the whole church. I saw a serious reception of Vatican I. I saw a refusal to surrender Christian teachings to the shifting pressures of modernity. I saw a belief that separation from Rome is not the end of the story. And I saw something else too, a love for English spiritual identity joined to a conviction that true unity requires communion with Rome. That combination spoke to me deeply. I did not want to abandon beauty, language, worship, or inheritance. I wanted them placed in truth. And the ordinariate gave me a place where that desire no longer had to be divided against itself. That's why the name Anglican Papalist is not just historically accurate to me. It's personal. It tells the truth about what I found. The historian and convert Hugh Ross Williamson used a phrase that strikes me. The walled garden. Outside the wall is exposure, instability, and wind. Inside the wall is order, peace, and cultivated life. That does not mean that the garden is soft or unreal. It means it is protected. It means what lives there can grow. For Williamson, entering the Catholic Church felt like stepping into the kind of garden, and I understand that image. The journey into Catholic life, and especially into the ordinariate, is not just a matter of changing labels. It is the experience of being gathered into something stable after living too long with fracture. It is the relief of finding the unity you longed for. It was not a fantasy. It was real. And it had a name. Church. This is not a dead story. It's happening now. There are parishes where the prayers still sound like sacred English, where the liturgical inheritance of Anglicanism is carried into the Catholic Church with reverence, where people who once lived at the distance of Rome now receive the Eucharist in full communion with her. That is not an experiment. It is a living reality. And for those of us inside of it, it is a reason for gratitude. The ordinariate is not a halfway house. It's not a compromise between two incompatible things. It is the church receiving a patrimony and making it whole. That's why this podcast exists. Not to mourn a lost world, not to rehearse old tensions for their own sake, but to tell the story of how the road that looked impossible became a place of arrival. My own road to the church was not simple. I did not begin as someone quietly interested in theology. I began as a suffering child, angry, suspicious, and far more comfortable with comic books and a boy from Queens got bit by a spider than with God. I lived with a body that did not work the way I wanted it to. I learned early how to hide the pain, how to joke instead of confess, and how to survive by keeping God at a distance. For a long time, I thought Spider-Man made more sense than religion. He understood responsibility. He understood suffering. He understood what it meant to be weak and still be called to something greater. Eventually, though, God began to interrupt that story. Not all at once, not in a neat line, but in a long series of mercies, confrontations, and expected graces. And when I finally came to the Catholic Church, I found that I had not been losing my story. I had been being brought into it. And that is why the ordinary matters to me so much. It's where the pieces of my own life began to make sense together with suffering, beauty, English Christianity, Catholic fullness, and the hard mercy of divine providence. So when I call the series the Anglican Papalist, I'm not using a clever label. I'm naming the place where theology, history, and testimony meet. I'm naming a tradition that pointed towards Rome, and I am naming the fulfillment of that tradition in the ordinary. I am naming the road that brought me there. But before we can understand the beauty of that homecoming, wink, we have to understand the world that made it necessary. Because the Church of England did not drift away from Rome by accident. Something happened. A principle was introduced, and the consequences of that principle shaped English Christianity for centuries. In the next episode, we turn to that rupture, the split with Rome, and the rise of Aristian control, and the long shadow that followed. Before you can understand the garden, you have to understand the wall. This is the Anglican Papalist.